Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today. My name is Rolim Baggio. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Queensland. I have recently submitted my thesis. And, oh, thank you, I am alive. And I would like to pay my deepest respect for the traditional owners of this land where we are gathering today. So, the background and context and significance of my research, as we all know, climate change is seriously impacting coral reefs here and around the world. In this catastrophic context, there is a climate change adaptation strategy called resilience-based management that emerged to enhance the resilience of the reef, basically by decreasing human pressures. Basically by doing what we are able to do. So the idea behind resilience-based management is to help the reef to survive climate change by cutting impacts. So we're not going to solve the problem of the reef by doing that, but we are going to buy some time to the reef until we are able to decrease emissions. That's the idea. There are many principles and recommendations to implement resilience-based management, but the legal and policy dimensions of RBM remains unexplored, and this is the gap of knowledge that my research addressed. So, considering that policy and legislations are drivers of impact reduction, my research used the Great Barrier Reef, where resilience-based management is being implemented, as a case study to identify the elements that should be considered by policy and legislation to support RBM. So the methodology here, first I focus on the impacts considered as very high by the by the GBR Outlook report. I excluded climate change, so I just focus on water pollution, land-based runoff, as we all know, modifying coastal habitats, and fishing. And so first, I made an inventory of policy and legislation that regulates these activities that cause these very high impacts. Based on the analysis of this policy and legislation, I developed the RBM Framework, and I applied the RBM framework to the Great Barrier Reef. So it was a kind of a looping. I used the policy and legislation to create the framework. Then I applied the framework to the same policy and legislation and came up with some recommendations for policy and legislation to support RBM. Is anyone with like the minutes thing showing? Oh, okay. So this is the framework. I try to keep it simple. So you have the columns here. First, the influence factors and the threats. Then we need to have a look at the scale of these threats and the jurisdictional complexity involved. What are the activities, in fact, that are causing these threats? And the legislation that regulates these activities, the policy that regulates these activities, and the government departments that are responsible for these policy and legislation. Also, it's very important to look at the coordination mechanisms to coordinate policies that sometimes can conflict or generate synergy. And also, it's very important to have a look at the engagement of First Nation people in the implementation of resilience-based management. So this is the framework applied to the GBR. We have here land-based runoff, coastal development, and then we have the jurisdictional complexity. It's a major. The scale, we need to consider also the time scale and the geographical scale. So it's a catchment and mainly inshore waters issue, and it's happening now. So here are all the legislation and policies that I analyzed. And here are the recommendations that I was able to come up with. I think that the most important are not the recommendations, but the process of using the framework and being able to come up with recommendations. So the first recommendation is to formally adopt the most efficient and effective policy mix, addressing the main activities causing the impacts and implement mechanisms for policy coherence. Recommendation number 2, policy legislation should adopt a comprehensive planning strategy and consider cumulative impacts. Number 3, policy legislation should be based in scientific, traditional, and communitarian knowledge. And recommendation number 4, policy and legislation should enable the protagonism of First Nation people in the design and implementation of policy instruments. And recommendation number 5, international collaboration is also very important. We have the example of the World Heritage Convention here that was responsible for a lot of policies, instruments in the Great Barrier Reef. So policy and legislation must adopt a holistic view, and my framework wanted to give this holistic view. I know it should be, my framework needs to be refined and also tested in other social ecological system. And next steps, that's what I'm planning on doing, and I would like to acknowledge that this research was supported by the Australian Government Research Training Program scholarship, and also to thank my supervisor, Justine Bell James and Pedro Fidelman, for their help during this long journey. Thank you.